Hundreds of American bombers were not lost because the enemy outflew them. They were lost because the wrong thing was trusted. By 1943, the U.S. bomber war looked overwhelming on paper. More aircraft, more crews, more firepower. The math said the losses were acceptable. The doctrine said the system worked. It didn't. High above Europe, something small was quietly undoing everything the planners believed. Not tactics, not bravery, not numbers. A detail buried so deep inside the system that no one in command wanted to touch it, because touching it would mean admitting the war had been bleeding from the inside. The weapon, meant to keep crews alive, was considered flawless. So flawless that every failure was blamed on people, not design. So trusted that no one thought to ask whether it still worked in the one environment where it mattered most. What followed wasn't chaos. It was repetition. The same altitude, the same conditions, the same moment when reliability was supposed to be guaranteed and wasn't. Most people never noticed. They were too busy counting aircraft, sorties, and acceptable losses. But buried in the reports was a pattern that, once understood, revealed something far more dangerous than enemy fighters. Because if that pattern was real, then the bomber war wasn't being decided in the sky. It was being shaped on the ground by a mistake so ordinary, so technical, that fixing it would quietly change the arithmetic of survival. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. It isn't the story you think it is. Stay with it. The real cause of failure is not where the war taught us to look. By the early 1942, the United States believed it had solved one of war's hardest problems: reliability. The Browning .50 caliber machine gun was everywhere, on tanks, on ships, on trucks, on bombers. It was not new. It was not experimental. It had been fired millions of times in tests, training grounds, and previous conflicts. To American planners, it represented something rare in war, a variable that no longer needed attention. In a system built on speed and scale, that mattered. The bomber war depended on assumptions, not emotional ones, but mechanical ones. Heavy bombers were slow, predictable, and vulnerable on their own. Their survival rested on formation discipline and overlapping fields of fire. That logic only worked if every gun did what Doctrine promised it would do every time, under all conditions. So the Browning was treated as a constant. It appeared in manuals as a solved problem, in briefings as a given, in planning tables as a fixed value. No asterisks, no caveats. Factories focused on producing airframes faster than losses could consume them. Training pipelines pushed crews through on tight schedules. Maintenance doctrine emphasized standardization: clean it, oil it, test it, return it to service. The system was optimized for throughput, not doubt. And on the ground, it worked. At sea level, in warm air, under controlled conditions, the Browning performed exactly as expected. It cycled smoothly. It fed reliably. It forgave small imperfections. That forgiveness became part of its reputation. The gun was known not just for power, but for tolerance. It worked even when conditions were not ideal. That reputation hardened into belief. Belief became doctrine. Doctrine became inertia. No one stopped to ask a simple question: what happens when the environment changes faster than the assumptions behind the weapon? The bomber war forced that question without asking permission. At operational altitude, heavy bombers lived in a different world. Temperatures plunged far below anything encountered in training. Air thinned. Vibration became constant, not occasional. Time in the cold stretched from minutes to hours. These were not edge cases. They were the normal operating conditions of the air war. But the weapon preparation did not change. Lubrication procedures remained the same. Inspection thresholds stayed fixed. Spring tolerances were judged by ground standards. The system assumed that if a weapon worked everywhere else, it would work here too. That assumption felt reasonable. It was also wrong. What made the Browning trusted its ability to forgive began to disappear as margins shrank. Oil that flowed freely on the ground thickened in the cold. Metal parts that fit comfortably at sea level tightened just enough to alter timing. Springs that returned with authority in warm air lost a fraction of their strength where fractions mattered. None of this was dramatic. None of it triggered alarms. The gun did not fail catastrophically. It failed conditionally. And conditional failures are the hardest for large systems to recognize. When something breaks all the time, it demands attention. When it breaks only under specific circumstances, it hides. Losses mounted, but they fit the model. Bomber crews were expected to be lost. Attrition was baked into the strategy. A few more aircraft missing from a formation did not automatically point to a flaw in doctrine. They pointed, instead, to the enemy. That was the danger of trusting a constant. Because once a system decides something no longer needs to be questioned, every failure gets explained away somewhere else. The weapon stays innocent. The assumptions remain untouched. And the war moves forward, carrying a flaw it refuses to see. The Browning had not betrayed the bomber war. The bomber war had simply taken it somewhere, was never recalibrated to survive, and the system had not noticed yet. The problem did not announce itself with explosions or alarms. It arrived quietly, carried by altitude. Heavy bombers were not designed to fight in the same world as the weapons mounted on them. As they climbed higher to escape ground fire and reach their targets, they entered an environment that compressed every mechanical margin. Air thinned, temperatures collapsed, vibration became constant, not incidental. What had once been tolerable variation became stress. At 25,000 feet, nothing behaves the way it does on the ground. Oil no longer flows the same way. It resists movement. What was once lubrication becomes drag. Metal contracts just enough to matter. Not enough to seize outright, but enough to alter timing. Springs return more slowly. The difference is measured in fractions of a second, fractions that mean nothing in a factory and everything in combat. The system was not blind to these conditions. Meteorologists briefed crews on temperature. Engineers understood cold. Manuals mentioned lubrication, but those acknowledgments lived in isolation. They were not allowed to question the larger assumption that a proven weapon remained reliable everywhere it was deployed. That assumption created a blind spot. The gun had been optimized for flexibility. It was designed to work across a wide range of environments. But wide is not infinite. The bomber war pushed it into a narrow corner of performance where tolerance shrank and forgiveness vanished. And yet, preparation did not change. Weapons were serviced according to ground logic. Lubrication was applied according to general guidance. Inspection thresholds were based on visible wear, not environmental stress. The system prepared the weapon for yesterday's war, then asked it to survive tomorrow's. When failures occurred, they appeared inconsistent. Some missions returned without issue, others did not. Some guns worked perfectly for long bursts, then hesitated at the worst possible moment. Some jammed early, others late. To a planner looking at aggregate numbers, this looked like randomness. It was not. The failures clustered around conditions that were rarely examined together. Altitude combined with cold. Cold combined with vibration. Vibration combined with short bursts of fire. Each factor alone was manageable. Together, they narrowed the operating window until there was no room left for error. This is how environmental mismatch hides. Nothing breaks all the time. Nothing fails everywhere. So nothing looks urgent. The bomber war rewarded speed. Missions were planned, flown, and repeated with little pause for reflection. Losses were tragic, but expected. The scale of the campaign absorbed individual breakdowns and kept moving. In such a system, only catastrophic failures force change. Conditional failures slip through. The weapon still worked often enough to preserve belief. When it failed, it did so without spectacle. No explosion. No obvious fracture. Just a hesitation where motion was required. And hesitation is easy to misinterpret. Training doctrine taught crews to assume human error first. Improper cleaning, incorrect technique, poor handling. These explanations were comforting because they did not threaten the system itself. If the operator was the problem, the solution was simple. More training, stricter procedures, tighter discipline. So that is what the system did. Checklists expanded. Bulletins were revised. Gunners were reminded to clean more thoroughly, cycle actions more aggressively, and adhere precisely to approved methods. Each response reinforced the belief that the core design was sound, but the environment did not care about belief. Every mission exposed the weapon to hours of cold soak before a single round was fired. Every vibration cycle worked against tolerances already compressed by temperature. Every burst tested timing margins that had never been recalibrated for this domain. The system treated the air war as an extension of ground war. The environment treated it as something else entirely. This mismatch created a dangerous illusion that the problem was rare enough to ignore and common enough to accept. A few lost aircraft here, a few there. Always within the bounds of what the math predicted. Always explainable without touching the assumptions underneath. That illusion held only as long as no one looked too closely. When failures repeat under the same conditions, they stop being accidents. They become evidence, and evidence does not announce itself. It accumulates. The air war had changed the rules of reliability. The system had not noticed. Not yet. The system is under pressure. It does not look for the truth. It looks for speed. By mid-campaign, the U.S. bomber war was expanding faster than its ability to reflect. Aircraft were rolling off assembly lines. Crews were cycling through training. Missions were scheduled days in advance. Every delay threatened momentum, and momentum was treated as survival. In that environment, failure could not be allowed to question fundamentals. So, when defensive guns failed, the system responded predictably. It blamed the nearest variable that could be corrected without slowing anything down. The operator. Gunners were reminded that technique mattered. Maintenance crews were told to clean more thoroughly. Supervisors emphasized proper lubrication and careful inspection according to existing standards. Training circulars were updated. Checklists grew longer. Responsibility flowed downward. This felt rational. If a machine works most of the time and fails only sometimes, the easiest explanation is misuse. That explanation protects the system. It preserves doctrine. It allows production to continue uninterrupted. And most importantly, it feels decisive. The alternative, questioning whether a trusted weapon was being prepared incorrectly for its environment, felt dangerous. It implied redesign, retraining, delay. Admitting that losses might not be inevitable, but preventable. Large systems resist that implication, because once failure is framed as systemic, responsibility spreads upward. Decisions made months earlier come back into question. Planning assumptions lose authority. Confidence fractures. So the system chose a safer narrative. Failures were framed as noise. Losses were framed as attrition. Reports were filed, acknowledged, and absorbed. The war machine kept moving. What made this loop so effective was that it worked just well enough to avoid collapse. Most guns still fired. Most missions still returned aircraft. The bomber stream did not stop. From a strategic altitude, nothing appeared broken. This is how flawed systems survive. They produce outcomes that are bad, but not catastrophic. They bleed slowly, not visibly. They normalize loss. Inside briefing rooms, the math still closed. If enough aircraft went out, enough would come back. Replacement crews filled gaps. Production compensated for destruction. The system did not need to be perfect. It only needed to be acceptable. That standard acceptable loss became a shield against inquiry. When crews reported jammed guns, the reports were not dismissed. They were categorized, filed, compared against expectations, and expectations already included loss. As long as the numbers stayed within predicted ranges, there was no trigger for escalation. The loop reinforced itself. Failures led to more training. More training led to more confidence. More confidence reduced appetite for doubt. And doubt was the only thing that could have exposed the flaw early. There was another effect, quieter but just as damaging. Because the weapon was considered reliable by definition, evidence to the contrary had nowhere to land. Reports described symptoms but avoided conclusions. Language softened. Phrases like jammed under unknown cause or suspected operator issue appeared again and again. Not because the crews believed them, but because that was the language the system accepted. Over time, the pattern was diluted by procedure. When everything is documented, nothing stands out. When every report looks the same, no single one feels urgent. The system mistook consistency for closure, and while commanders focused on sorties and targets, the underlying mismatch deepened. Guns were cycled through maintenance depots and returned to service unchanged. Springs weakened incrementally. Lubrication behaved differently with each cold-soaked mission. Timing margins eroded invisibly. None of this violated doctrine. All of it complied with procedure. That was the paradox. The bomber war was losing aircraft not because rules were ignored, but because they were followed too faithfully in the wrong context. The system believed it was correcting the problem. In reality, it was insulating itself from the only correction that mattered. This is the danger of feedback loops that never reach decision makers. Information flowed upward, but meaning did not. Data was plentiful. Interpretation was scarce. Level translated the problem into language that fit existing assumptions. By the time it reached the top, the original signal was gone. What remained was reassurance. The guns work. Losses are expected. The system is sound, and as long as that story held, nothing fundamental would change. But patterns do not disappear because they are ignored. They wait. They wait for someone willing to slow down long enough to see them not as isolated failures, but as a single question repeating itself in different handwriting. The wrong response loop could continue indefinitely, until it didn't. War did not lack information. It lacked permission to interpret it. Every mission generated paper, after-action reports, maintenance logs, crew notes scribbled between briefings. Each document captured fragments of reality temperatures, altitudes, burst lengths, stoppages. Individually, they were unremarkable. Collectively, they formed a picture the system was not structured to see. Because the system already had a story. The story said the weapon was reliable. The story said losses were acceptable. The story said variation was inevitable. Data that supported the story flowed easily. Data that complicated it stalled. This was not censorship. It was alignment. Reports were written in the language crews were trained to use. They described events without interpretation. Gun jammed after short burst. Cleared stoppage. Cause unknown. The words were accurate. They were also incomplete. Accuracy without synthesis produces noise, and noise is easy to ignore. The system treated data as confirmation, not inquiry. Numbers were tallied, compared to expectations, and filed away. If losses did not spike beyond predicted curves, the underlying assumptions remained untouched. No one was tasked with asking whether the predictions themselves were wrong. This is how narrative outruns evidence. Patterns existed, but they were distributed across units, bases, and theaters. One report from England, another from Italy, another from training ranges stateside. Different handwriting, different phrasing. Same conditions, same outcomes, but no mechanism existed to place them side by side. Large systems excel at aggregation. They struggle with correlation. Aggregation answers the question, how much? Correlation answers the question, why? The bomber war optimized for the first. As a result, repetition was misread as coincidence. When the same failure appears everywhere, it can look normal. When it appears under similar conditions, it can still be dismissed if no one is responsible for connecting the dots. The narrative protected itself through scale. Hundreds of aircraft meant hundreds of variables. Weather, enemy tactics, crew experience, mechanical wear. Each offered a plausible explanation. The true cause did not need to be disproven. It only needed to be lost among alternatives. This is where systems hide their mistakes. They do not erase evidence. They surround it. Even when individuals sensed something was wrong, the structure discouraged pursuit. To challenge the narrative required time to compare reports, to isolate variables, to test hypotheses. Time was the one resource the war refused to grant. Speed was rewarded. Reflection was deferred. And deferral has a cost, because the data did not change. It accumulated. Each new report added weight to a pattern that had no name. Failures clustered around altitude bands, around temperature ranges, around the same moment in defensive engagement. Short bursts followed by hesitation. Not always, not predictably to the casual reader, but often enough to be meaningful. Meaning, however, requires a listener. The system listened for confirmation. The data asked for interpretation. Those are different skills. The narrative framed the weapon as neutral and the environment as hostile. The data suggested something more uncomfortable. The environment was exposing a mismatch the system had chosen not to address. But mismatch does not announce itself as error. It announces itself as inconvenience. And inconvenience is easy to tolerate in wartime, so the reports continued to pile up. They were complete, accurate, and ineffective. They told the truth in pieces. No one assembled them. This is the paradox of modern warfare. Information is abundant. Insight is scarce. When systems grow large, they become better at recording events and worse at understanding them. Responsibility fragments. Authority concentrates, and meaning falls between levels. The bomber war embodied this perfectly. Crews knew something was wrong because they lived with the consequences. Maintenance teams sensed patterns because they touched the hardware. Commanders saw numbers that still made strategic sense. Everyone was correct within their frame. No one owned the full picture. And so the narrative held, until someone treated the data not as documentation, but as testimony. As proof that the system worked, but as evidence that it didn't, at least not under the conditions that mattered most. That shift did not require a breakthrough. It required attention. And attention is rare in a system optimized for motion. The question was never whether the data existed. The question was whether anyone would stop long enough to listen to what it was trying to say. The problem was never that the weapon was poorly designed. The problem was that it was being prepared for a world it no longer operated in. When the data was finally treated as evidence instead of paperwork, a different picture emerged. Not of random malfunction, but of consistency. The failures obeyed rules. They appeared only when specific conditions aligned. Altitude, temperature, duration of fire, vibration. The gun was not breaking. It was falling out of tolerance. Mechanical systems do not fail all at once. They fail by losing margin, and margin is invisible until it is gone. On the ground, the Browning 50 had room to forgive. Springs returned with force to spare. Lubrication flowed easily. Timing windows were wide enough to absorb small variations in wear, dirt, or handling. The design assumed that these margins would always exist. At altitude, they didn't. Cold did not freeze the weapon solid. That would have been obvious. Instead, it thickened lubrication just enough to slow movement. Metal did not seize. It contracted by thousandths of an inch, just enough to alter alignment. Springs did not snap. They returned a fraction slower, a fraction weaker. Each change was minor. Together, they rewrote the timing of the system. The Browning depends on a precise sequence of events. Feed, chamber, fire, extract, eject, reset. Each step hands off to the next, within a narrow window. When everything moves as expected, the cycle feels continuous. When timing slips, the cycle hesitates. Not enough to stop permanently, just enough to fail at the wrong moment. Short bursts became a problem not because they were improper, but because they exposed the weapon to its most fragile timing state. The system had not been optimized for repeated cold-soaked pauses followed by sudden demand. On the ground, that demand was trivial. In the air, it was decisive. Lubrication was the silent culprit. Oil, specified to work across a wide range of environments, behaved differently when that range was exceeded for hours at a time. At high altitude, oil that protected parts on the ground became resistance in the cold. Applied generously as Doctrine encouraged it, narrowed timing margins instead of preserving them. The gun was not starved. It was slowed. Springs told the same story. Rated acceptable under normal inspection standards, they performed exactly as expected until cold stole elasticity and vibration consumed the remainder. No single spring failed inspection, but many hovered just close enough to the edge that the environment pushed them over. This is where the system's assumptions collapsed. Inspection protocols looked for visible damage. The failure lived in invisible drift. The weapon was being judged by ground criteria in an air war. The environment had changed. The metrics had not. Once this mismatch was understood, the solution stopped looking dramatic. It did not require redesign. It did not require new weapons. It required recalibration and admission that good enough on the ground was no longer good enough in the sky. Preparation mattered more than power. The fix was procedural, not heroic. Reduce lubricant viscosity for cold operations. Apply it sparingly, only where motion demanded it. Adjust spring inspection thresholds to account for prolonged cold exposure. Replace marginal components earlier, not later. Pre-flight cycling procedures needed to reflect temperature, not habit. None of this violated physics. None of it contradicted the design. It contradicted complacency. The danger lay not in implementing the fix, but in acknowledging what it implied. If such a small adjustment could reduce failures, then the losses that preceded it were not inevitable. They were the cost of a mismatch no one wanted to slow down to see. That truth was uncomfortable, so the solution moved quietly. No public announcement, no doctrinal rewrite, just controlled tests. A limited number of aircraft prepared differently, same missions, same opposition, same crews, unaware of the change. Only one variable was altered. Preparation matched to environment. The results did not arrive as celebration. They arrived as absence. Absence of reports. Absence of familiar notes. Absence of the same failure repeating itself. Where stoppages had once clustered, continuity appeared. Where short bursts had once invited hesitation, they now flowed. Did not become perfect. They became predictable. And predictability is the foundation of trust. Trust changed behavior. Gunners no longer fought their equipment. Formation discipline improved. Ammunition was conserved. Defensive arcs overlapped more consistently. Enemy pilots adjusted, not because they had been defeated, but because the window they relied on no longer opened. This is how small fixes scale. Not by headlines, by repetition. The preparation spread faster than paperwork. Maintenance crews compared notes. Crew chiefs adopted practices that felt safer. By the time official guidance caught up, the change was already embedded. The system adapted without ever announcing that it had been wrong. That is how large systems preserve themselves. They absorb correction and erase authorship. The fix becomes routine. The failure fades from memory. What remains is the illusion that the system always worked this way. But the lesson is clear for anyone willing to look. The bomber war was not saved by a new weapon or a bold doctrine. It was stabilized by understanding that reliability is not a fixed trait. It is a relationship between design and environment. When that relationship changes, preparation must change with it. The gun did not need to be stronger. It needed to be understood, and once it was, the arithmetic of survival began to shift, quietly, relentlessly, one mission at a time. Change did not arrive as an announcement. It arrived as consistency. At first, nothing looked different. The aircraft were the same. The crews were the same. The enemy was the same. Missions followed the same routes, at the same altitudes, under the same conditions that had produced losses before. But the outcome began to drift, not dramatically, not immediately, just enough to register. Reports that once included familiar phrases no longer did. The words, jammed after short burst, appeared less often. Maintenance logs grew shorter. The absence of a problem replaced the problem itself. And absence is difficult to argue with. This is how systemic change actually spreads. Not through orders, but through relief. When a solution reduces stress without creating new risk, it does not need justification. Crews feel it. Maintenance teams see it. Confidence returns quietly, without speeches or slogans. The system adapts because it wants to, not because it is told to. The fix did not make the bombers invulnerable. It made them predictable. Predictability altered behavior on both sides of the engagement. Gunners, no longer bracing for failure, held fire longer. Short, panicked bursts gave way to deliberate ones. Ammunition lasted longer. Fields of fire overlapped more reliably. Formation discipline tightened, not because crews became braver, but because they trusted the machinery supporting them. Trust changes posture. When equipment works, mental load drops. Crews stop improvising survival and return to executing doctrine. Communication improves. Decisions become calmer. Small errors stop cascading into emergencies. These effects compound. A bomber that holds formation longer forces attackers to commit deeper. Engagement windows narrow. Fighters test from farther out. Break-offs happen earlier. Not because the bombers are more aggressive, but because the cost of probing increases. Enemy behavior adjusts. Intelligence summaries begin to notice it. Intercepts become shorter. Attack profiles shift. Head-on passes replace tail chases. Ammunition expenditure rises for diminishing returns. Losses still occur, but the curve flattens where it once climbed. This is not speculation, it is arithmetic. Every aircraft that returns can fly again. Every crew that survives carries experience forward. Experience compounds faster than replacements ever can. In an attritional campaign, survivability is not sentiment, it is efficiency. The fix revealed something planners had underestimated. Reliability does not just prevent failure. It reshapes the battlefield. As fewer emergencies demanded escort intervention, fighters were freed to operate offensively rather than defensively. Escort doctrine became more flexible. Resources once consumed by rescue shifted toward disruption. The system gained options it did not previously have. All of this emerged from a change so small it barely registered as strategy. No new doctrine was written. No new weapon was introduced. No victory was declared. The war absorbed the correction and moved on. This is how large systems prefer it. Corrections that demand recognition threaten authority. Corrections that arrive quietly preserve it. The solution was framed as refinement, not reversal. Preparation adjusted. Standards tightened. Cold weather kits standardized. Lubrication guidance revised. Spring tolerances tracked more aggressively. Each change sounded technical. Together, they became strategic. The language remained procedural because procedure travels. Crews did not need to understand why the fix worked. They only needed to know that it did. Trust spread faster than explanation ever could. And once embedded, the fix became invisible. Future crews would assume the preparation had always been this way. The memory of failure faded. The system protected itself by erasing the distinction between before and after. That erasure is the price of success. Because when a fix works well enough, no one remembers the problem it solved. The absence of failure becomes normal, and normal never feels like a turning point. But the impact was real. Loss rates attributed to defensive failure began to level off. Not vanish, level off. In a campaign built on attrition, that distinction mattered. It meant time bought, crews retained, aircraft reused, pressure applied steadily instead of in bursts cut short by malfunction. The bomber war did not change overnight. It bent, and bending was enough. This is the quiet truth of systemic warfare. Wars are rarely decided by single decisive moments. They are shaped by repeated corrections that remove self-inflicted weaknesses. Each correction shifts probability slightly. Over thousands of missions, slight shifts become advantage. The small fix did not win the war. It allowed the war to be fought on better terms. And that is often the most any system can hope for. Because endurance does not come from brilliance. It comes from eliminating the mistakes no one wants to slow down to see. The impact of the fix was not measured in gunfire. It was measured in arithmetic. Strategic bombing was never just about explosives. It was about sustaining a system under pressure long enough for numbers to matter. Aircraft, crews, maintenance hours, training pipelines. Each mission represented an investment that only paid off if it survived to fly again. Reliability protected that investment. When defensive failures decreased, the immediate effect looked modest. A few more aircraft returned intact. A few fewer crews were listed as missing. On any single day, the difference was easy to dismiss. Over weeks and months, it altered the equation planners relied on. Attrition curves flattened. This mattered because the bomber war was a campaign of accumulation. Experience compounded faster than production. Veteran crews coordinated better, navigated more efficiently, and reacted more calmly under fire. Every aircraft that returned intact carried not just metal, but memory. Memory is strategic. When systems preserve experience, they gain leverage without changing doctrine. Missions become more predictable. Variability decreases. Commanders can plan with narrower margins because uncertainty has been reduced. The fix did not make bombers safer in isolation. It made the entire campaign more efficient. Enemy response confirmed this. As bomber formations became less predictable and more resilient, intercept tactics shifted. Fighters committed less deeply. Engagement windows shortened. Ammunition was spent for fewer opportunities. Risk accumulated on the attacker's side instead of being transferred automatically to the bombers. This forced adaptation. Adaptation carries cost. Training changes. Tactics evolve. Pilots learn through trial and error is expensive. The bomber war did not eliminate the threat. It raised the price of exploiting it. This shift rippled outward. Escort fighters, once tied closely to rescue roles, gained flexibility. With fewer defensive emergencies, they could disrupt enemy formations rather than merely shield bombers from collapse. Airspace became contested on chosen terms instead of dictated by crisis. Production priorities adjusted quietly. The question ceased to be only how many aircraft could be built this month, but how many could remain operational next month. Maintenance guidance grew more specific. Cold weather preparation became standardized. Reliability entered planning discussions as a variable, not an assumption. That change was subtle. It was also profound, because it reframed survivability as production efficiency by another name. An aircraft lost is not just a loss of metal. It is a loss of trained labor, accumulated experience, and future sorties that will never be flown. When reliability improves, the system retains its investment longer. That retention compounds across the campaign. The fix revealed a strategic truth, often obscured by heroics. Wars are not won solely by creating power. They are won by preserving it. The bomber war had been bleeding capability through a preventable weakness. Removing that weakness did not guarantee victory. It ensured endurance. And endurance shaped outcomes more reliably than any single innovation. There was a philosophical consequence as well. Once reliability was treated as adjustable rather than fixed, responsibility changed. Losses once accepted as fate became subjects of inquiry. The idea that systems could be improved even during war gained legitimacy. This altered internal dynamics. Engineers and maintenance crews gained quiet influence. Their observations carried weight when backed by results. The distance between hangar floor and operations board narrowed, not through revolution, but through evidence. The system learned something dangerous but necessary. If outcomes can be improved, then failure is not inevitable. It is something to be examined. That realization does not produce headlines. It produces restraint. The bomber war did not suddenly become safe. Crews still faced flak, fighters, and fatigue. But the campaign stopped sabotaging itself in small, invisible ways. And that alone changed the strategic balance. Not by speed, not by spectacle, but by endurance. And endurance, once secured, allowed everything else to work as intended. War did not end because of this fix. It continued, as wars always do, messy, costly, unresolved until exhaustion decides the terms. But something fundamental had changed. The bomber war stopped bleeding from a weakness it had created for itself. No parade marked the moment. No briefing slide announced a breakthrough. The adjustment disappeared into routine, into checklists, into habits future crews would assume had always existed. That is how large systems record success, by erasing the memory of failure. The guns fired when asked. Formations held longer. Aircraft returned that otherwise would not have. And slowly, quietly, the arithmetic of the war bent. This raises an uncomfortable question. If such a small correction could alter outcomes across thousands of missions, how many losses had been accepted not because they were unavoidable, but because no one slowed down long enough to question what everyone believed was already solved? This story is often framed as one about recognition or injustice. It is not. It is about attention. The weapon did not fail because fate demanded it. It failed because physics does not negotiate with doctrine. Cold thickens oil. Metal contracts. Springs lose elasticity. These are not opinions. They are conditions. War punishes systems that pretend otherwise. The most dangerous failures do not announce themselves as disasters. They arrive as patterns dismissed as noise. Large systems are especially vulnerable to this. They are excellent at moving forward and terrible at listening sideways. They reward momentum, not reflection. Speed outruns understanding. Assumptions harden because questioning them feels like delay. And delay, in war, feels like weakness. But the truth is harsher. Speed without alignment multiplies error. Mass without reliability collapses under its own weight. What saved lives here was not brilliance in the heroic sense. It was humility. The willingness to accept that a trusted solution no longer fit a changed reality. The willingness to treat reliability not as a trait, but as a relationship between design, environment, and preparation. That lesson extends beyond this one campaign. Wars are often explained through decisive moments and dramatic inventions. Those make for clean stories. Reality is rarely clean. It lives in maintenance manuals, inspection thresholds, and small decisions repeated until they become advantage. Endurance is built there. The people who make those adjustments rarely become legends. Their work dissolves into routine. When it succeeds, no one notices. When it fails, crews pay the price. That imbalance shapes how history is remembered and how it is misunderstood. By the time the war ended, the fix was no longer discussed. It did not need to be. The system had absorbed it. Survivability had become adjustable. Reliability had become a variable worth protecting. And that, more than any single innovation, changed how the war could be fought. Not louder, not faster, but longer. The guns did not win the war. They allowed the war to be endured, and endurance, quiet, uncelebrated, built one correction at a time, is how wars are actually decided. The story changed how you think wars are decided. You already understand why these details matter.